At the turn of the 20th century in Dayton, Ohio, Hawthorne Street looked much as it does today. Men and women are still living who remember how in the years 1900, 1901, 1902, 1903, the quiet, slow-spoken Wright brothers came walking down Hawthorne, back again from their journeys to Kitty Hawk, and how with that bent, alert, probing way of theirs, they strode past the homes of Vance the harness maker, Pahoud the stone cutter, Wellborn the wagon maker, Wolfram the carriage trimmer. Year after year, they came quietly home to number 7 Hawthorne Street. But once within the house, reserve left them. With their father, Bishop Milton Wright, their sister Catherine, or the young girl Carrie Grumbach listening unobtrusively, the Wright brothers studied aloud, discussed exhaustively, argued in detail, and at last conceived the principles that were to open the skies to the navigation of men. Around the corner from Hawthorne on 4th Street, Orville and Wilbur Wright tested not only their ideas, but they examined the theories of other men who had explored the possibilities of flight. Cayley, Lilienthal, Chanute, Langley. The Wrights devised methods of measuring the accuracy of aeronautical theories, including their own. The home was their discussion hall, the shop, their laboratory. Both today are gone from Dayton, moved as monuments to the Wright memory to the museum at Greenfield Village in Dearborn. Discussion hall, laboratory, and testing devices such as their first wind tunnel had their place. But the Wrights at once had recognized an axiom of aviation that still endures. Proof must come in the air. On this windswept beach in 1900, 1901, and 1902, they tested gliders they had built. They taught themselves to be pilots of a high order. They were critical men, but at last, their 1902 model pleased them. They flew it farther and with better control than any other glider that man had ever devised. They came back from Kitty Hawk in 1902 with the knowledge that they had solved flight's paramount secret, control. And in the spring of 1903, they designed a 4-cylinder engine and fashioned 2 propellers. When they next went to Kitty Hawk, they flew. On December 17, 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright made man's first 4 controlled flights in a powered airplane. That day, they lifted the world into a new dimension. What the Wrights had achieved at Kitty Hawk barely evoked passing attention in a nation whose people were absorbed with the problems of a dynamic new age. There were other less celestial wonders closer at hand. The automobile, the telephone, the motion picture. But at number 7 Hawthorne Street, December 17, 1903 was a momentous day. The young girl who was then the Wrights' housekeeper, Carrie Grumbach, remembers.
I remember the telegram when it come, that they had flown, that they had done what they said they would do. They always did as they had planned.
The telegram from Kitty Hawk had a special significance for the mechanic who worked in the Wrights' bicycle shop, Charlie Taylor.
Of course, I was greatly pleased to know that it had been accomplished, but at that time it didn't seem to be anything wonderful at that. I started on repairing bicycles back in the 80s. And then I later went to Dayton and built bicycles for the Stoddard Manufacturing Company. And they were just starting up in the bicycle business. Then I got acquainted with the Wrights and I built bicycles for them. I did all the repair work while they went down to Kitty Hawk to try out their gliders. Well, and all they needed was power to keep on flying. Why, then when we designed the motor, I made all the different parts in the motor. I even made the crankshaft. So I made it out of a solid block of steel, about 32 inches long, 6 inches wide, and 1 5/8 thick. cut it right out of the solid block by drilling holes and knocking out large pieces out of it, and then turning it up in the lathe. The motor itself, from the time I started till I had it ready for test, was 6 weeks. 50 years ago, I can remember as though it was yesterday almost.
There was not a complete indifference to the Wrights' discovery. A small group of Americans were laboring to further the art. And in Europe, where the airplane's military potential was quickly realized, a fresh wave of enthusiasm for aviation followed the Wrights' success. In France, Blériot, Farman, and Briquet were flying airplanes of their own design. The Englishman Currie and the Brazilian Santos Dumont, most of whose experiments took place in France, also captured the imagination of Europe with successful flights. The Wrights had offered to demonstrate their airplane to the United States Army shortly after their first successful flights. The Army declined, preferring to develop its small fleet of balloons as an air arm. Oddly, it was a young balloonist lieutenant of the Army who finally was instrumental in obtaining a chance for the Wrights and their airplane, Frank P. Long.
After 4 long years of failing to recognize the Wrights, finally, in December of 1907, the Board of Ordnance and Fortification granted an interview to Wilbur. At once, he inspired their confidence. This led to a contract in February of 1908 between the Wright brothers and the Signal Corps, in which they agreed to furnish an airplane that would fly 40 miles an hour, carry 2 persons, remain in the air for 1 hour, and, strange to relate, was to have some kind of a device by which, in case the motor stopped, it could be landed without crashing. In the summer of 1908, Orville Wright brought to Fort Myer, Virginia, the airplane that was to fulfill the specifications of the contract. Day after day, we watched him fly around and around the field in his tuning-up flights. And finally, on the 9th of September, he broke the world's record by staying in the air for over 1 hour. On landing, he came to me and said, "Would you like to go up?" You can guess my answer. And I made my first flight in an airplane that day with Orville Wright, 6 minutes and 40 seconds.
Lieutenant Law became the first military officer ever to fly in an airplane. 8 days later, tragedy struck. On a flight at Fort Myer, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge was killed. Orville Wright injured. Shocked, but not deterred, both the Army and the Wrights moved to improve the airplane.
In the summer of 1909, both Wilbur and Orville Wright came to Fort Myer, this time with a new airplane. It fulfilled the specifications, including an hour's flight, in which it was my good fortune to ride with Orville for 1 hour and 12 minutes.
Another young Army lieutenant, Benjamin Falloy, had a chance to fly in the Wright plane at Fort Myer.
On the day following the endurance test with Orville Wright and Lieutenant Lom, the Orville, with a quiet little grin on his face, invited me to be his guest on the crucial and final cross-country and speed tests. The grin on Orville's face was for my benefit, particularly as I'd been responsible for laying out the course between Fort Myer and Alexandria, Virginia, and there was not a landing field on the entire homebound course except Fort Myer drill ground. On July 30th, we took off on the final cross-country and speed test. Shortly after we straightened out on the course for Alexandria, Orville, with this same little grin on his face, told me that if he had to land anywhere on the route, and he'd pick out the thickest clump of trees he could find and land on top of them. Fortunately, the little engine that we had at the time carried us all the way through without any difficulty. And we finally landed back at Fort Myer Drill Ground with 3 world records, cross-country, 10 miles, altitude, 600 feet, and speed, 42.5 miles an hour.
The United States Army had an airplane. The need now was for pilots.
There, in the fall of 1909, under Wilbur Wright's instruction, Lieutenant F.E. Humphreys of U.S. Engineers and myself were taught to fly, and at the end of some 3 hours, were soloed and told we were pilots.
So in 1909, the military airplane was mated to the military pilot. Meanwhile, all over the world, aviation pioneers, encouraged by the Wright brothers' flights, were hard at work. The principles of flight were now widely known, and designers were applying them to many types of aircraft. Glenn Curtiss, Glenn Martin, and the Canadian J.A.D. McCurdy were designing and flying airplanes in competition and for exhibition. In Europe, the airplanes of Blériot, Paulhan, Farman, and de Havilland were demonstrating obvious advances in both speed and range. And in Russia, Igor Sikorsky was taking his first steps into the age of flight.
And I remember very, very well the early interesting period in France in 1909 and 1910, when the very first attempts were made to push aviation from the purely original experimental flying to some kind of successful practical achievement. I have seen Blériot coming in the same factory to purchase his motor, on which a few months later he crossed the English Channel. And at that time, I had my share of failures with the first helicopter, which was a fine machine, only it couldn't fly.
Glenn Martin remembers an episode of his pioneering days.
I've just been reading an old postcard sent by our family doctor to my mother, dated September 30th, 1910. This is at a time when I just began to leave the ground in a flying machine. And it says, "For heaven's sake, if you have any influence with that wild-eyed, hallucinated young man, call him off before he is killed. Have him devote his energies to substantial, feasible, and profitable pursuits, leaving dreaming to the professional dreamers."
For a dreamer, Glenn Martin was attracting a remarkable group of clear-thinking young designers as workmen. The first to join him was Donald Douglas.
I guess I must be getting old, because somehow it becomes fun to reminisce. Well, my first memory of things in aviation was seeing the first Wright airplane demonstrated for the Signal Corps in 1908 at Fort Myers, outside of Washington. So I took the streetcar and one thing and another and got out to Fort Myers. Well, there she was, as I had seen her pictured, the old Wright pusher. And there were Wilbur and Orville. And there was that old launching device that kind of looked like a guillotine, and they had the airplane perched up at the starting part of the track and the weight all ready to go. And I remember well, I believe it was Wilbur, going out and holding up a bit of dust and dropping it to see that there wasn't a bit of wind. And then, as I recall, it was Wilbur that got into the machine with, I guess it was Colonel Lom. And they pulled the old latch, and down this little wooden track it went with those funny old props batting around at apparently a pretty slow speed, and off she went.
One of the first pilots was Roy Nobenschuh, who was a balloonist even before he became an airplane pilot.
This gentleman I'm pointing out right back of the pilot was Walter Brookins. Walter was a great pilot. His judgment was uncanny, but he was very temperamental. As a matter of fact, he, Arch Hoxsey, and Ralph Johnson was the three best pilots that the Wright Company had, and each one tried to outdo the other. My friend Dick Ferris remarked to me one time, he said, "I have been an impresario. I've handled actors and prima donnas. But," he says, "these aviators start in where the other fellow leaves off. And," he says, "it's impossible to do anything with them."
The ambitions of some designers went far beyond their skills. As Igor Sikorsky has said,
"In the history of aviation, there have been many contraptions which, to the good fortune of their inventors, failed to fly.
Inventors of a high skill sometimes were deadly serious in demonstrating the utility man could expect from the airplane. Lawrence Sperry, whose contributions to the aircraft instrument field were momentous, puts a pre-war aircraft through its paces. All this ferment, however often it seemed to lack direction, was contributing in one way or another to the growth of aviation. The airplane was growing cleaner in design. Its horsepower was more dependable. The disparaging term aeronaut was giving way to aviator, a term of respect. Aviation was emerging as a science. A pioneer aeronautical engineer and educator, Dr. Jerome Hunsaker.
Professional education in aeronautical engineering began in this country at MIT in the winter of 1913-14. This course was started by President McLaurin borrowing me from the Navy Department and supplying me with one assistant as staff, who was a recent graduate in mechanical engineering, Donald Douglas, from whom more was to be heard.
The pusher engine of early planes had been replaced by the tractor engine installations which allowed higher speeds. The Wrights were foreseeing these helpful aircraft devices, and other inventors, such as Elmer Sperry, were inventing and refining them. Here, a Curtiss seaplane flies with the early Sperry automatic pilot. Almost without exception in the first decade of the airplane, the designers were pilots. They built, tested, and flew their own designs. The Wrights, Blériot, Santos Dumont, Curtiss, Rose, Sikorsky, de Havilland, and Martin. At Glenn Martin's, a band of engineers and craftsmen had gathered together whose names in time would be synonymous with aircraft designs of world rank. Donald Douglas, James H. Dutch Kindleberger, Lawrence Larry Bell, Alan Lockheed, John Northrop. The United States was the cradle of flight. Inventors of a high order had appeared. Our pilots were unmatched. First-rate designers emerged. Brilliant men specialized in the components of the airplane. But as a pioneer who specialized in aircraft horsepower, Frederick B. Rentschler summarizes.
Prior to World War I, our most important contribution to aviation was the flight of the Wright brothers.
From December 1909 to March 1911, 13 months, the entire United States Air Force consisted of one officer, myself, one civilian mechanic, 8 enlisted men, and 1 airplane. The government at that time wasn't very keen about turning money loose for flying. I had the great appropriation of $150 allotted to me to take care of the airplane for the entire year 1910. January 1910, Chief Signal Officer directed me to proceed to Fort Sam, Houston, Texas, to teach myself how to fly. On March 2nd, I made 4 flights, 3 good and 1 bad. The last one, I cracked up and put the plane in the shop for about 10 days. After each crack up, I used to sit down and try to puzzle out what had happened. Then I'd write to the Wright brothers and tell them all that I thought had happened. They'd proceed to write back and tell me what I ought to have done. In other words, I expect that I'm about the only man living today who learned to fly by correspondence.
2 air-minded young lieutenants shortly joined General Falloy, the one-man Air Force. They were Hap Arnold and T. DeWitt Milling.
Looking back 42 years ago to March 1911, the month in which General Arnold and myself were ordered to Dayton to learn to fly with the Wright brothers, and to think of the plane that we used at that time and see the advance that has been made since, it seems incomprehensible that one man in his own lifetime could live through such progress. After our very brief period of instruction of about a week, 2 to 3 hours in order to learn to fly, we were sent to College Park, Maryland. We immediately started in to try to find some method
by which we could develop from the standpoint of taking photographs, using the machine gun, dropping bombs.
The air arm of the United States Navy began under equally apathetic circumstances. Naval Aviator Number 3 was Admiral John H. Towers.
In the autumn of 1911, when I was quite a young naval officer serving aboard one of our battleships, I got the idea that I wanted to learn to fly, that naval aviation would amount to something for naval purposes. So I put in a request to the Navy Department, and they came back and quite frankly said that they didn't believe aviation would ever amount to anything. But if it turned out to be otherwise, they would consider my request. During that winter, Congress appropriated money for the Navy to buy 3 airplanes, so they were in it whether or not they wanted to be. And then they decided to select 3 officers to be taught to fly as part of the contract with the manufacturers of the airplanes. I was fortunate enough to be one of those 3 officers. The other 2 were Ellison and Rogers. I also became a very close friend of Glenn Curtis and was associated with him throughout his whole life. The man had an enormous amount of vision. He had already conducted, in cooperation with the Navy, tests of landing an airplane on a platform, on a cruiser, and also of taking off. But he had in his mind then the idea which later developed into the powerful carriers that we have today.
The airplane now had official recognition, both from the Army and the Navy, but it was a cautious acceptance. The time-forged armament still held sway. When the fledgling Army flyers experimented with a primitive bomb sight and a Lewis machine gun installed in aircraft at College Park, Maryland, they landed and foresaw whole battles that someday might be fought in the air. The War Department promptly pierced that bubble. An official spokesman pointed out with finality that the Army had airplanes for just one purpose: reconnaissance. From a pistol shot at Sarajevo, the first of the great modern world wars exploded. And almost overnight, all of Europe was engulfed in conflict. Once the great armies had met head-on, the conflict resolved itself into a desperate struggle to hold this plot of ground, this foot of earth. Military analysts called it positional warfare. But the foot soldiers knew it only as a war of trenches, a desperate fight for a waterlogged hole. Automotive power began to supplement the feeding, supplying, and tending of troops burrowed in the earth. The tank made its combat appearance. But for many months, the First World War remained an earthbound conflict. The airplane was put to work just as the U.S. War Department spokesman had prophesied, as observation and scouting craft. The source of peril lay in the artillery, machine gun, and rifle fire, scourging the entrenched troops from across the wasted land. But in the air, Allied and German pilots often waved to each other as they passed on their observation missions. Then, instead of the courteous wave, the opposing pilots began exchanging pistol fire. Presently, the first crudely mounted machine guns appeared. Now, the frantic race of inventing, improvising, adapting, and refining aircraft equipment began. Quickly, the Germans countered the hand-operated machine gun by installing upon their aircraft the invention of Tony Fokker, a machine gun synchronized to fire through the aircraft propeller. A paramount lesson that the Allies were to remember a generation later was being learned in air warfare for the first time. No design capable of still further development could be frozen. And countermeasures must be met by countermeasures. It was becoming clear that no nation or race had a corner on inventive skill. While the single-engined airplane had been engrossing most designers, in Russia, Igor Sikorsky...
In 1912, I decided that the time came to build a large machine with several motors. At that time, I was certain already that the future of aviation will be connected with fairly large aircraft, that the closed cabin with its comfort, protection from wind and so forth represent a must. In 13, I completed my first four-motored airplane, the Grand. The ship proved a complete success. It flew quite well.
The Grand's military successor, the Ilya Muromets, was the first four-engine bomber in world history. It struck time after time at the Central Powers on the Eastern Front. The internal combustion engine now became an instrument of intensive technical development. The first successful engine had not been developed until 1860. One of the world's foremost engine designers, Leonard S. Hobbs, recollects its history.
It starts out actually with a little-known Frenchman by the name of Lenoir, who has never gotten the credit he deserved. He built and actually marketed the first internal combustion engine, and it was from his engine that the Wright brothers were able to build one. Of course, the early pre-war power plants are fairly well known, the Anzanis and the Curtiss OXs. The First World War did mark a great advance in power plants. First, there were the rotaries, the Clergets, the Nomrones. Then there was the Renault engine, which was a very good French engine. The British RAF engines. Toward the end of the war came the very beginning of what I think is the modern engine. First, there was the Hispano Suiza with its solid block and a valve arrangement which is standard in a lot of engines to this day. Also, out of the First World War came a remarkable German effort, the BMW. Now, this engine is the first engine that I know of in all history that attempted to overcome the effects of altitude on power.
Into a conflict in which European antagonists had been tempered by 3 years of savage battle, whose equipment had been perfected by the necessity of survival without regard to cost, the United States now plunged. It was the world's 14th ranking air power, with only 28 airplanes, 65 pilots, supplemented by 50 flying students. Its Navy combat air arm was even smaller. Its industry lacked integration. The nation that had allotted Benny Falloy $150 in 1910 for maintenance of that year's Air Force promptly voted $600 million to fulfill a plea by the Allies to have 5,000 airplanes and 4,500 pilots on the Western Front by the spring of 1918. When we entered the war, the country knew that the United States already had an industrial capacity double that of Great Britain, France, and Germany combined. We quickly realized that to supplement the meager aeronautical developments resulting from years of federal indifference to air power, we had to obtain licenses for the production of proved British and French airplanes and aircraft engines in our new factories. Our national mistake was the assumption that an instrument as dynamic as the airplane could be designed, tested, and developed overnight. Thousands of rookie pilots training in the United States and in England and France had an inspiring example of American air combat performance through the brilliant exploits of the Lafayette Escadrille, a team of American volunteers who had joined the Allied cause in 1916. But American performance had its hours of frustration. One of the first young pilots to see action in France with the 1st Aero Squadron was Oliver P. Eccles.
We'd been equipped with a new type of French airplane with a new and very much improved engines. These airplanes were assigned to us. The squadron had the strength of 18 airplanes, and we were assigned the mission of supporting one of the American divisions one afternoon in the attack. Our airplanes took off 18 strong. During the afternoon,
All of the airplanes force landed from engine failure. Fortunately, none of them behind the enemy line. But out of the 18 airplanes that went out, none of them got back.
The pilots of World War I made the term dogfight synonymous with their work. America's top ace, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker of the famed 94th Hat-in-Ring Squadron, reflects on the different approaches to combat of the pilots of World War I and the pilots of today.
That individualism was possible because the planes were much slower. You'd stay in maneuver. Whereas today, it's impossible because of the tremendous speed, the difference of 100 miles an hour and 600 or 700 miles an hour. We had 150 horsepower. Today, if they haven't got 5,000 or 6,000 horsepower, it's no good. We had 2 little pop guns, 30 caliber, that would shoot sometimes 450 rounds a minute. Today, they've got 6 and 8 50 caliber guns that'll shoot 1,000 rounds a minute with a couple of cannon thrown in, 20 millimeter or 37 millimeter cannon, and then maybe a half a dozen or a dozen rockets that have terrific destructive power, all of which means that today the time element is so limited for a pilot in combat with an enemy that it's a matter of a fraction of a second. Today is a cockpit full of instruments and gadgets. It's pressurized, it's air conditioned. We had a gasoline gauge, an oil gauge. We had a tachometer or a revolution counter. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and the fourth instrument was an altimeter that we could never rely on.
The Navy's pre-war requests for funds to build up its air arm had been denied, and only a skeleton Naval Air Force existed. A naval officer whose career has bridged 2 wars in aeronautics, Admiral DeWitt C. Ramsey.
From the outset, the Navy's problem has been to bring aircraft into the mobile operating forces of the fleet. We may say that this had its start in World War I and the post-World War I period, when kite balloons were used from battleships and auxiliaries for gunfire spotting and tactical reconnaissance. The equipment was very cumbersome, and as hydrogen was used as the lifting gas for the balloons, we found that it was not a satisfactory measure of doing a naval job. So they were abandoned after a relatively short trial. The real beginning of naval aviation, let us say, took place in England, where during World War I, the latter part of it, the British converted 2 ships, the Furious and the Argus, and built into them the features which were desirable for aircraft launching and recovery. I happened to have been in England at about that period and kept our Navy Department informed of the progress of the British in this field. As a result, the Navy embarked on an initial program of converting the old Collier Jupiter into our first flat top, the Langley.
In 1918, as the war began to move toward its climax, American aircraft equipment still had not entered combat. An intensive effort was being made to perfect the Liberty engine. Before the Liberty or any other aerial product of the United States designing boards could be put in action, the final critical offensive of World War I had begun. Millions of men pulled out of trenches to attack or retreat. Above them, to be sure, planes flew in bombing and strafing missions. Individual pilots whose names became legendary met in dogfights. Germany's von Richthofen, France's Fonck, Canada's Bishop, Germany's Goering, and such American aces as Rickenbacker, Luke, Lufberry, Vaughan, Springs, Kindley, Landis, Schwab, Hunter.
retrospect, it might be said that aviation itself has served a very small part in the result of the World War I conflict. However, it did prove itself. That is, it was easy to recognize that with proper equipment, at another later time, aviation might become a real instrument of military warfare.
After the war was over, a great many of American boys had been taught to fly, but they didn't get to the front. Of course, after the war was over, they had nothing to do, and there were a great many surplus airplanes. And that is the period when you hear so much about of the days of barnstorming. After the war, with all these surplus airplanes, a lot of the fellows who had been taught to fly then decided to go out and carry passengers and do stunts and regular exhibition flying, principally at county fairs and state fairs and things of that sort.
Both the Army and Navy Air Arms shortly were reduced once again to organizations hardly larger than the membership of a civic club. Yet in both services, the men who remained were uniquely zealous advocates of their calling. Almost to a man, they realized they had only begun to explore the capacities that the airplane offered in size, speed, range, and altitude performance. A decade was dawning in American history that was to be known flippantly as the era of wonderful nonsense. Beneath its surface corruption, its wild enthusiasms, and its extravagant posturing, history now has found that it was a time in which men in many fields of the arts and sciences were employing immense physical energy to attain goals of a sober worth. Aviation had its share of such men. The accomplishments of the 20s were presaged in 1919 by man's first flight across the Atlantic Ocean. The NC-4, a large flying boat whose development had begun during the war, was chosen, as the Navy's pioneer pilot Admiral Towers points out, for the ambitious task.
When the war was over, the first one was just about completed. So I proposed to the Navy Department that we go ahead the following spring and with as many of these aircraft as could be built by that time, that the Navy undertake to be the first to fly the Atlantic. Luckily for me, I was selected to command that expedition. It's all history now. 2 of the 3 airplanes landing at sea in very rough water were so damaged they couldn't make it, but the NC-4 made it from Newfoundland to the Azores to Lisbon.
Army pilots already had inaugurated airmail service on May 15, 1918, a service that had been under discussion since 1910. William Boeing, who had entered aviation in 1916, was instrumental in starting the first international airmail service on the North American continent.
In 1919, Eddie Hubbard and I took a flight up to Vancouver, BC. On our return trip, the postmaster at Vancouver handed us a mail sack for delivery to the postmaster at Seattle. This was the first international mail ever carried by plane into the United States.
What real utilities the airplane actually offered were overshadowed in the public eye by its use as a spectacular stunting device throughout the pastures and primitive flying fields of the country. The Jenny could be bought for as little as $50, and men who had flying in their blood preferred to scramble for the few dollars they could make risking their lives in exhibition flying rather than seeking out pedestrian jobs. As one of them, Dick Depew, cheerfully said, "The greatest hazard in flying is the risk of starving to death." Abruptly, the country's attention concentrated on a single man with a single theme. Brigadier General William Mitchell, who had had a distinguished war record, argued that the Mahan doctrine of sea power had been outmoded by the airplane and pleaded for a separate national air arm. He contended, in seeking a $60 million appropriation for Army air services, or about half the cost of a single battleship, that the United States could begin developing an air force which could hold mastery of both the air and the seas. Larry Bell was still with Glenn Martin when,
That resulted in Congress bringing about a test wherein one of the targets that we were supposed to sink or try to sink was the famous Ostfriesland, the pride of the German Navy, which we had captured. This ship was anchored about 100 miles offshore, and 6 of the Martin bombers went out, each carrying a 2,000-pound bomb. They paraded over the battleship, and they dropped the 6 bombs, and only one hit it, and that was by mistake. The rest were timed to detonate at 100 feet below the surface, and it practically exploded the Ostfriesland. At least it ripped the bottom of the ship from bow to stern, and the ship sank in 4 minutes.
The Navy had already begun systematically to broaden the scope of its Bureau of Aeronautics. Many of its men, whose views of the need for air power were not as vehement as Billy Mitchell's, nevertheless already had envisioned carriers as the heart of future striking forces. Admiral Ramsey was the navigator of the Navy's first flat top, the Langley.
The Langley had at best 14 knots maximum speed, and that's all the wind speed she could generate and manufacture, so we had to wait for adequate wind conditions to perform flight operations.
The nation's first large aircraft carriers, the Saratoga and the Lexington, were designed and were being built.
These great ships, developing approximately 180,000 horsepower, manufactured all of the wind that was needed in the absence of a surface wind for flight operations.
The nation accepted the airplane and tacitly agreed with its advocates, but there was still no federal provision for long-range planning and procurement. Nevertheless, a corps of designers and manufacturers stayed with the business. In the ceaseless drive to attain longer range and more reliable performance, the airplane, its engine, its components, and its instruments steadily were growing more complex. But the primary goal was speed. Roscoe Turner.
I have maintained ever since that I've been flying that there's only one reason for flying, and that is speed. It's 1910, Curtis, 49 miles an hour. 1910, White, 61 miles an hour. 1911, Wyman, 78 miles an hour. 1920, Moseley, 156 miles an hour. Maughan, in 1922, 206 miles an hour. And 1925, Doolittle, 232 miles an hour.
Jimmy Doolittle, a hell-for-leather pilot, whose own cold judgment was that he was essentially a technician.
These record flights have a very real meaning. Competition has perhaps always been the greatest stimulus to improvement. And out of this competition came improvements that were improvements in the performance of aircraft and the safety of aircraft, and those improvements were immediately applicable to the military and indirectly applicable to commercial aviation.
The ferment of the early 20s brought forth men who combined technical gifts with a skill of organization. A few such men, like Chance Vaught, had formed their own companies and built successful airplanes. Others had served their apprenticeship with aviation's early pioneers, but now they were branching out on their own. Dutch Kindleberger recollects a small episode that launched an enduring company.
Even in the 35 years that I've been messing with it myself, there have been vast changes, particularly technically. I can remember very distinctly when, at the Martin Company in 1920, Don Douglas, who was then the chief engineer, left to come out to California to start his own business. I helped him pack. We packed up from his office about, 2 ordinary condensed milk cartons full of data. In those 2 cartons, we put everything that was known and printed, and some of it wrong, about the science of aviation engineering. Today, you couldn't pack into this room the index of such technical information, let alone the subject matter.
The machine began to get complicated, and from there on came the specialists. A great many great men have contributed to aviation purely as specialists. Sperry, one of the greatest. Colonel Clark, who devised one of the first good airfoils. Sam Heron came along on his cylinders and his fuel
and then Frank Mock with his carburation devices and later fuel injection. Frank Caldwell with his propeller.
Our earliest propellers were all wooden propellers, but they had several shortcomings. They were subject to atmospheric troubles, and they twisted out of shape in various climates. And they were also quite thick, so that at the high speed at which propeller tips operated, they were losing efficiency. One of the things which we did to overcome this was to develop a metal propeller, which first was a drop-forged aluminum alloy blade. Being very much thinner than the wooden ones, the efficiency was maintained in better condition, and also they were quite stable in various atmospheric conditions.
Sam Herron began working on aircraft engines as early as 1909, and shortly went to the Royal Aircraft Factory in England.
I came to this country in 1921, and for the next 5 years was engaged in air-cooled cylinder development. It was really the air-cooled engine that made fuel development so necessary. The first move was to put tetraethyl lead in the existing gasoline. Later, the Air Force got the idea of adding the component that has the high end of the octane scale to the gasoline, and that eventually led to 100 octane gasoline.
Frank Mock, the carburation and fuel control specialist.
Our carburation work has always had to be a good bit like that of the Wright brothers, in the respect that we could get little guide from the textbook. The automobile carburetor, of course, was designed to operate on the level. The aircraft carburetors have to climb, dive, even fly upside down. Also, they have to go up an altitude where the air is thin.
Mock, Hobbs, Sperry, Clark, Caldwell, Herron. The singular devotion with which these men and scores of other specialists pursued their particular fields leads H.M. Jack Horner, whose own specialty of aircraft production combined the fruits of all their labors, to say,
that heritage of research, development, the background work that goes into aircraft has continued throughout the whole existence of aircraft and the great improvements that have come there too. After that, with flight becoming a little bit more common, I think it's important to realize the fervor with which those individuals did carry on their work. It was a passion with them.
Then, midway in the 20s, came two events that turned the course of American aviation sharply upward. First, the government adopted the recommendations of President Coolidge's Morrow Board. These called for a sustained aircraft procurement program built on the foundation of a privately operated and technically competitive aircraft industry. Although both military airmen and technologists were convinced that the airplane long before had outgrown its function as a scout, the bulk of our aircraft still consisted of observation planes. Now, new, more powerful engines began to emerge for advanced aircraft, which both services had developed. The nation moved rapidly from a third-rate air power to international leadership. The second event was the successful dream Charles Lindbergh made come true. In his single-engine Ryan monoplane, Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic non-stop to Paris. 2 weeks later, carrying Charles Levine as a passenger, Clarence Chamberlain flew the Atlantic and landed in Germany.
First of all, we were trying to beat Lindbergh away. And second, we had to keep our plans a deep, dark secret because we had overheard Mrs. Levine say, if I thought my Charlie was going in that airplane, I'd burn it up. We finally got away about 6 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of June, 1927. The first 1,000 miles to Newfoundland was through with good weather. The only trouble was we had headwinds. And our tests on Long Island showed that we could fly for 40 hours at 100 miles an hour. Well, on the flight up to Newfoundland, we were only making 70 miles an hour. And 70 miles an hour for 40 hours is 2,800 miles. It was 3,200 to land on the other side, leaving the last 400 to swim. Well, fortunately, the wind shifted after we left Newfoundland, and as you see, we made it.
Lindbergh's lonely adventure gripped the imagination of the world as one of man's most dramatic achievements. The nation turned from its casual cynicism to make the shy young pilot, together with the airplane, a shining symbol of the horizon still beckoning for conquest. A vital factor in the ascendancy of American aircraft had resulted from the work of two companies concentrating on the intensive development of the radial air-cooled engine.
In this country, Charlie Lawrence was the first one to go into the air-cooled side and did some quite good work. His products being eventually taken over by the Wright company. And it was really one of his engines after a couple of major designs, and they were really major designs, but one of his engines that powered the Lindbergh flight. Following this came one of the best of all of the power plant engineers, George J. Meade, with his famous Wasp and Hornets, which set up a new standard. These engines had built-in superchargers and just about all the modern features. In fact, they are fairly representative of today's engines. Along with this came another of the major developments in the power plant, that is the turbo supercharger. The turbo supercharger was really quite a long time coming. The Frenchman by the name of Rateau had originally started to try and get it, but it took the General Electric Company and Dr. Moss to get this thing, which made almost all the difference in the world.
The unusual engineering accomplishments of our American aeronautical industry began to bear fruit in the late 20s and early 30s. From a military point of view, for the first time, our various types of combat planes were unmatched abroad. Moreover, we found the solid beginning of commercial air transport.
I remember very well one evening when Lindbergh and I were sitting in a small restaurant in Cuba, which we reached as the end of a Caribbean flight, and using the menu for paper, we made sketches of a transatlantic clipper. That was back in '31. A few years later, the transatlantic clippers have been produced, created, proved success, and as at present, we know that transoceanic flying is perfect routine, perfectly self-evident part of our modern life.
Jimmy Doolittle pioneered transcontinental non-stop flights.
In 1922, I flew from Pablo Beach, Florida, near Jacksonville, to San Diego, California, a distance of about 2,200 miles in 22 hours and 20 minutes. In 1931, I flew from Los Angeles, California to New York in 11 hours and 15 minutes. That first flight was the first time that the continent had ever been crossed in less than 1 day. The second flight was the first time it had ever been crossed in less than half a day.
Meantime, the Army and the Navy air arms were making fast strides in developing aviation. They were flying farther, higher, and faster. The Air Corps was perfecting its concept of the bomber as a long-range strategic weapon. In its exercises, the Navy was demonstrating the soundness of the carrier task force. Individual officers were exploring the use of new instruments and accessories and testing new theories to determine aircraft reliability. Two famous Army pilots, Carl Toohey Spotts and Ira Aker, flew 7 days in 1929 without landing.
The question mark flight was an endeavor to use refueling as a means of keeping the plane in the air for a long time. The driving inspiration behind it, I believe, was Ira Aker. On the course between San Diego and Burbank, we passed over the home of Mrs. Spott's father and mother. And every time he passed over, she would take my oldest daughter, who was then about 6 or 7, out to see us go overhead. And on the 5th or 6th day, she pointed us out to Taddy and said, "Taddy, there's your daddy up there. He's been up in the air for 5 or 6 days, for 5 days. Don't you think it's wonderful?" And Taddy looked up and said, "No, I think it's dumb." But the flight did prove that refueling was practical.
General Aker remembers an incident that forecast the need for equipment which would permit line flying.
In 1919, flying in the Philippines from Manila to Stotsenburg, our station at that time, I ran into a typhoon, and the rain was so heavy that I couldn't see the horizon. I fell in a spin, and only the fact that the Manila Bay was yellow and the rain was darker was I able to recover from the spin and fly home. To my surprise, I found for the first time that when you couldn't see, you couldn't fly. I described this to Lieutenant Longfellow, later General Longfellow in the Second World War, and we began some crude experiments by hanging a plumb bob down across the instrument board and by putting a carpenter's level on the longeron, and got so that with these two aids, we could fly through cloud, through several thousand feet of cloud. And that was one of the early days of instrument flying.
10 years after General Aker's Manila experience, Jimmy Doolittle, in association with the Sperry Company, tackled the problem.
I made the first blind flight, the first completely blind flight, taking off under a hood, flying a prescribed course, and landing back under the hood without ever having seen out of the airplane. This doesn't sound very important now, but out of that came two instruments, the artificial horizon and the directional gyro, that are today standard equipment on every commercial airplane and every combat military airplane.
The chain of development led back to General Aker.
During the first transcontinental blind flight, Bill Kepner and I had a very practical but unexpected demonstration of the value of instrument flying. My ship was a P-12 with a hood over it, and a similar ship, a P-12, Bill followed behind as the safety pilot so that he could tell me to turn right or left to avoid obstacles or other planes in flight. At one point, he was giving me rather repeated instructions, and I could tell by the water seeping under the cover that we were in a heavy rainstorm. Finally, he said, "Hold your present course steadily. I'm going to fly formation on you." In 4 or 5 minutes, he called on the radio again, and he said, "We've come through the storm now, and I can see again." During that period of time, you led us through because I couldn't see either.
The Great Depression had come. The industry was hard hit, but nevertheless, new companies developed to meet the increasing complexity of the airplane and its growing use of metals, electronics, and automatic controls. Dutch Kindleberger departed from Douglas to take over North American. Companies were formed bearing the famous names Bell, Fairchild, Northrop, Beech, Cessna. A World War Navy pilot, Leroy Grumman, left civil engineering to enter aviation.
We knew that a conventional airplane wouldn't get us an order. We finally ended up with the design of the first military fighter with retractable landing gear, for which we got a contract and which proved to be highly successful, having a speed far in excess of any current Army or Navy fighter of that time.
A pioneer aviation journalist, Earl Findlay, once went to see the Wright brothers' contemporary, Thomas Edison.
I asked if I could have a short interview with Mr. Edison. You had to get up awful close to him. He'd put his hand up like this, saying, Mr. Edison, what do you think of the airplane? Oh, airplane? And this was after he had been talking to Foreman all morning in the biplane. Never amount to a damn till they got to do it different. They have to have something like a hummingbird. Go up and go this way and come back this way, that way, this way, and come down, he said. Well, I tried it once. 'Tain't easy. And I got to doing something else. But somebody's gonna do it.
But that's remained the opposite side of speed, namely the aircraft that could fly with no speed at all, that could take off from any spot and would not be in need of an airport at all.
The 30s also were the years in which each summer fierce competition was held to determine the best of the airplane breed. Proof of the individual airplanes, engines, and pilots came in the national air races. With thousands looking on, the legendary pilots raced. Doolittle, Hazlip, Turner, Whitman, Levere, Goulbach, Newman, Fuller, Jacqueline Cochran. And flyers still flew against the clock, across the continent, across the seas, and indeed around the world itself. Balkan, Post, Gatty, Byrd, Hughes, Amelia Earhart, and wrong way Corrigan. As the hour swung late in the 30s, the air races were curiously American. For in Europe and Asia, aviation was not a case of relatively puny efforts in some, such as America was providing, much of it from individual men and companies. Rather, the vast resources of powerful foreign nations now were thrown behind the construction of air forces designed to subdue the world or to defend against such aggression. In the United States, under the impact of a depression, Congress had scrapped the Morrow Board procurement plan and stopped providing appropriations for 1,800 military airplanes that had been scheduled. On New Year's Day, 1936, the Army Air Corps had only 300 planes fit for war duty. A year later, we had dropped to 6th place among powers in air combat strength, although our industry was judged to be technically at least 18 months ahead of foreign competition. Lamented, "If I had had 4,000 airplanes, there would have been no Munich." France had squandered a first-rate air power while she sat behind the Maginot Line. The British, too, had let the Axis powers outstrip them. Frantically, both countries turned toward the United States, aware that, in the very act of running hard to meet crisis after crisis, an emphasis had been placed upon research, experiment, and development, which gave the United States technically superior aviation equipment. So the free world turned to the United States, not only for airplanes, but all of those weapons embodying the modern arsenal. To expand its facilities, train workers, and to adapt its job shop operations to techniques of mass production took time. The tooling was still underway when Germany struck. Poland was shattered. Holland and Belgium were overrun. France succumbed.
Gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge of mortal danger, are turning the tide of war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Now the stubborn British stood alone. Over Poland, Holland, Belgium, and France, Germany's Luftwaffe had demonstrated that the airplane was a vital weapon of modern offensive war. In the skies above England, the Royal Air Force now demonstrated that the airplane was a vital instrument of modern defensive war. The struggle in Europe shook America. A month after Congress had received a bill providing only 61 combat airplanes for the Army Air Corps for the following year, President Roosevelt called for a long-range production program of 50,000 airplanes. America slowly mobilized its productive capacity. It began to draft its young men. It sought to train them with wooden guns, cardboard tanks, and mock airplanes until it could gear its productive capacity to build the real thing. The war spread. Germany seized Norway, turned on its momentary ally Russia, overran Greece, joined its partner Italy in Africa, and encouraged its Asiatic ally Japan. Nothing could have convinced the people of America more surely of the bitter nature of modern war than the sneak punch that Japan threw at Pearl Harbor. The nation fell to work to expand its token battle forces and its production into a great tide of men and machines. To train men and to equip them required long months, particularly in aviation.
Immediately after the President's pronouncement in 1940, licenses were given to the automotive group largely to assist in the production schedules which lie ahead. Nevertheless, until the end of 1943, the equipment which actually saw service on the various fighting fronts all over the world were furnished entirely by the aeronautical industry, because it was a fact that it required 20 months to 2 years for the average automotive company to begin.
With their momentum at full flood, the Japanese swept through the Pacific. Jimmy Doolittle and a little band of flyers carried the war home to them in a joint Navy-Air Force operation.
I've frequently been asked, what was the purpose and what was the effect of the first Tokyo raid? Well, the purpose was to take the war to Japan, to show them that their island was not inviolate. The effect? Well, the effect was to cause them to divert some of their military strength that was needed in the South Pacific to the protection of the home islands. The actual damaging effect was very little. Our airplanes were on the Hornet. We were intercepted just after daylight on the morning of April 18th, 1942, by Japanese surface craft. We took off immediately, proceeded to target, and all but one of the planes carried on to the coast of China. We carried 1 ton of bombs in each one of 16 airplanes. We dropped 16 tons of bombs on 4 or 5 different targets. When you realize that from the Marianas in the later stages of the war, B-29s were carrying as much as 6,000 tons of bombs in one operation and dropping them on a single target, you realize how puny our effort was.
Slowly, the nation began to regain control of the air and the sea lanes that it had lost in the Pacific. The first great victory was the Battle of the Coral Sea. Captain Thatch, one of the Navy's ablest flyers and tacticians, remembers that battle and the subsequent Battle of Midway.
If you're going to apply the principle of concentration of force, for example, you've got to work with other people and have a good system of teamwork. I think that's one of the reasons why an attack by a carrier-based air group is so effective. It's almost a simultaneous thing, like a 1-2 punch in boxing. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, for example, the dive bombers and torpedo planes and the fighters came in almost simultaneously, but the enemy concentrated on the dive bombers At the same time, that let the torpedo planes in, and they did most of the damage. On the other hand, in the Battle of Midway later, the enemy fighters concentrated on the torpedo planes, and the dive bombers came in almost unmolested. I could see them coming down like a huge waterfall, and there were practically no misses. They were the ones that did the job in the Battle of Midway.
With its growing stream of trained soldiers, sailors, and airmen equipped with improved weapons, the United States and her allies took the offensive. Rommel was driven from Africa. Sicily and Italy were invaded. From their bases in England, American bombers began to strike at the heart of Germany under the direction of General Spaatz.
Strategic bombing was one of the ways of winning the war. And our fighter operations, in a large measure, developed into covering operations for the bombers. In order to do that, we had to have the development that had taken place. Good radio, so the leader of the fighter outfits could not only talk to his own men, but be in communication with the bombers, and in turn get some guidance from ground control stations on the ground by radio. This resulted in a different type of fighting and a different type of operation. But it proved conclusively in World War II that the airplane had developed to such an extent that air warfare became a different war altogether than land and sea warfare.
Wellwood Beale, a member of the team of designers who created the B-17, saw the airplane altered from a defensive to an offensive weapon.
The conception of strategic air bombing was not fully developed at that point. Originally, for instance, the B-17 was built to protect our coast from an invading fleet, and hence it was called the Flying Fortress. But when we got to England, it was obvious that to use these bombers to the greatest advantage, that we would have to not only get the enemy's supply lines, but the places where he manufactured his military equipment. The British thought it would be easier to do it at night. They'd have much greater chance of success and would be less vulnerable to enemy fighters. And they called their bombing saturation bombing. They dropped large numbers of bombs on a large industrial area. The Americans, however, decided that with the B-17 and the B-24, that they could pinpoint a specific target. For instance, the ball bearing factory at Schweinfurt. They, in order to do the job properly, decided that it should be done at daytime, where their bomb sight was the most effective.
Step by step, the Allies began sweeping back across the reaches of the Pacific. At terrible cost, we took Tarawa, Saipan, Kwajalein, Guam, Bougainville, and the Philippines, setting the stage for the aerial assault on Japan itself. At home, the United States had channeled its great energies and its vast technologies to produce in flood the goods of war. And now, with our allies, our integrated sea, land, and air combat team attacked.
No one in aviation believes that aviation alone won the war. We do believe that the war might not have been won by ourselves and our allies, except that we had control of the air.
The massive, intricate, highly trained combat team that America had put together at a stupendous cost dissolved almost overnight. A free people yielded to a free impulse. They demobilized their men and discarded much of their equipment. In the field of aviation alone, they had built an incredible 96,318 airplanes in the war year of 1944. 2 years later, the production had shrunk to 1,669 planes. Where the civilian aviation interest had turned to stunting and barnstorming at the end of World War I, now the airplane had assumed the civilian role of a fast passenger and freight carrier. The network of airlines, which had sprung up in the 20s and 30s, was extended to every corner of the free world. 4-engine transports of ocean-spanning range sped millions of passengers across the continent and across the seas. The wartime DC-4 and Constellation were followed by faster, farther-ranging successors, DC-6s, advanced Constellations, Stratocruisers, and such twin-engine ships as the 202 and 340. In a time of spiraling costs, only air travel grew cheaper. From fewer than 6,000 passengers the airlines had hauled in 1926, they quickly rose to where in 1952 they carried 24 million passengers, 12 billion passenger miles. The Wright brothers' vision was still the goal of virtually all men in aviation, such as Robert Gross, whose industrial team produced the Constellation series.
Of course, it's obvious to, I guess, everyone that the airplane has been preponderantly military since its start many years ago. But there are signs, particularly in the last few years, that perhaps it wasn't always going to be ponderantly a military weapon. Man and science must go forward hand in hand. It can do a lot of things, this airplane. It can bring hundreds of millions of people throughout the world in intimate contact with one another. And contact with one another means understanding, and understanding in the end means peace.
Shannon and Tarrant with connections to Southern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Far East. Will all passengers kindly board their clipper through gate number 10? All aboard, please.
In the war's closing hours, Germany had employed guided missiles brutally, but without decisive effect. Simultaneously, England and Germany had put a few airplanes in the air powered by a radical new type of engine, the jet turbine.
The jet became really important in aviation. The accumulated engineering know-how that this country had built up with its piston engine equipment suddenly became very much less important. This event was really a great leveler in engineering background and potential for all countries. And we had to start over again to try to regain the supremacy which we had in World War II.
In their march across Germany, Russia had seized Germany's military tools and designs and many of the engineers who were developing the jet. The Russians now increasingly saw the Allied victory in which they had been a partner as largely their own. The Western world was either bled white by the war or demobilized. Russia and its communist allies alone kept their armies intact. Their whole creed was one of force, and they began imposing that force on Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Russia's abrupt belligerence forced this country's attention upon the air power we had let melt away. For the third time in little more than a generation, the nation set about building a modern air arm. This one to be shaped around the fantastic speeds the gas turbine engine provided. Then, in 1948, when the Russians sealed off the land corridors leading to western Berlin, the United States, England, and France countered with the famous Berlin airlift. From their bases outside the Iron Curtain, a steady stream of airplanes flew night and day, supplying West Berlin's 2 million residents with food, fuel, and medicine. Finally, the communists capitulated and reopened the land corridor. Then they sent their minions into war in Korea. There, the United Nations chose to stand and fight. It was a strange, bitter, circumscribed war. The Air Force's prime striking weapon, its Strategic Air Command, was ruled out of bounds. The first sustained jet combat in history took place in a quadrangle of sky up to 40,000 feet above the Earth, but always south of the Yalu River. Russia sent aloft a first-rate jet fighter, the MiG. Only the Air Force's Sabre from the United Nations array of fighter planes could match it. It was a war in which transport airplanes flew 7,000 miles to deliver materiel and to return sick and wounded men. And it was a war in which the helicopter, with its ability to fly standing still and land anywhere, did a multitude of jobs. Among them, transporting literally thousands of wounded from the battlefield to rear area hospitals for prompt surgical attention. Under the impact of Korea, the nation had begun again to turn out modern aircraft in quantities. Mundy Peel, the chairman of the Industries Association.
That we as an aircraft industry are at the present time turning out about 14,000 airplanes. At the moment, we are a healthy industry. We have to pour back a tremendous amount of funds into research and development, funds that we earn when we make the airplanes. This is a very healthy thing. It creates competition. We want competition.
Dutch Kindleberger, whose organization built the Sabre, pictures the sky 10 miles high as man flies at a speed approaching that of sound.
Today, we're flying at very great speeds and at very high altitudes. As a matter of fact, up in the area at which a lot of the fighting is being done, around 50,000 feet, we have a different world. It's a thin blue, dark blue air. The sun doesn't shine so brilliantly because there's nothing to reflect it. There's no plane of reference for the pilots, such as hills or clouds or sky. In such an atmosphere as this, even a bomber is hard to see. And the trouble that we are facing, the future, is not the sound barrier. We know how to fly through that now. The thing that is bothering everybody is the thermodynamic barrier. The air flowing over an airplane at these very high speeds by friction will heat up the surface of the airplane. As a matter of fact, if we go to Mach number 2, which is twice the speed of sound at sea level, the surface of the airplane will get hot very rapidly and will stabilize at about 500 degrees. Well, since ordinary aluminum alloy loses half its strength by 350 degrees, and that even titanium and steels begin to give trouble at 500 and 600 degrees, it's obvious that we are in a great deal of difficulty in the future. There also are many things like hydraulic fluid. We don't know how to make hydraulic fluid that won't boil away at this temperature. We don't know how to make packings that won't seize at this temperature, or bearings, or lubricants. In fact, if the bubble with which everybody is familiar gets soft and would lose its shape and disappear at 300 degrees. So we have ahead of us a great deal of research and a long, long time of trouble before we're going to be going anything like the speeds at which our magazine supplement writers seem to think we're ready for tomorrow.
Modern test pilots who fly at sonic speeds and incredible altitudes take an equally factual view of their calling. Tex Johnston sums up his philosophy after putting the J-57 powered B-52 through its paces.
After 12 years of testing, 10 years in the jet field, involving the first jet airplane to fly in this country, the P-59, the first rocket airplane to fly in the United States, the X-1, incidentally the first airplane to fly faster than the speed of sound, the B-47, the B-52. I believe all the more in the two old sayings. First, that one test flight is worth 1,000 expert opinions, and the other one for the flyboys, the altitude above you and runway behind you will never do you any good.
Chuck Yeager, the first man to fly through the sonic barrier, and Bill Bridgman, a test pilot who has flown almost twice the speed of sound and has piloted a plane at an altitude of 79,000 feet, discussed their calling in language peculiarly their own.
Certainly enjoyed the work. I think launching's the only safe way to get into that kind of flying. It's a heck of a lot safer than takeoffs, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you burn so much fuel when you take off before you get up to the altitude where the airplane can drop you. And I personally think that's the most fun involved in a flight is when the guy cuts you loose, you're just hanging there for a minute, just like on a roller coaster.
Yeah. You were pretty close to the stall, too, when you came out of there, weren't you? When
Yeah.
You dropped out of 29?
We stalled at around 240 indicated with full fuel load. So one time, I remember Jack Ridley, we had a release failure, and he dropped me out at about 180 indicated, and I didn't know which end was up for a while.
Well, I noticed on the skyrocket that when we first dropped out, you could kind of feel the stall by watching the boom out there. When the boom began to shake while she was on the nipple. I don't know whether
you see it bend?
See it oscillate a little bit, yeah.
And so the airplane has evolved from the Wrights, whose first flights at Kitty Hawk were at speeds hardly faster than an athlete can run, to speeds today where the Bridgmans, the Jaegers, and the Johnstons travel faster than a bullet. Horizons far beyond today's achievements still beckon.
Your name, sir?
Frank P. Long.
Have you flown before?
Yes, I've flown before.